So I invite them to reach the place. We will be speaking about symbolic treasure, care, and materiality in after Svaneti. You have the floor.
Thank you. So while Nutsa's setting up the presentation, I'll just mention what we're here and what we're going to talk about. Nutsa's anthropologist, I'm a historian. We're not art historians, but we spent several years, many months over the last few years in Svaneti, researching the interaction of objects, treasure, materiality, and most importantly, the local people. So what we're really interested in is how the treasure, all those stuff that you saw there during your trip in Svaneti, contributes to the notions of sovereignty, power, relationship between the state and the local population, and so on and so forth. Now, the first thing I definitely need to mention is that the project has been very generously sponsored, and Nutsa has won some of the most prestigious grants in anthropology. This Wennet Grant Foundation has funded the research. James MacDonald Foundation is one of the donors, one of the very generous donors, and finally John Templeton Foundation at Oxford, who contributed in terms of the study of religion and religious practices. So Nutsa's going to talk about, Nutsa's going to be the principal speaker because she's the leading researcher in this field, and I'll just try to contribute from my perspective, from the historian's perspective, with really few words later on. So the floor is yours, Nutsa, at this point.
Thank you all for having me here. First of all, it's a great honor and a great pleasure, and a little scary too. I will just mention this is a work in progress. It's more of a brainstorming for us, and for me, I do a lot of conceptual theoretical work, so just to shift the perspective on things that you all know and study, and many people are here very well aware of. How can we understand them, these objects and these artifacts in situ, in their ethnographic contexts? I always begin with an ethnographic vignette, and here I begin with, it was a huge tragedy, says Dariko when she tells us the story about Hadishi manuscript removal from the village. The entire village, children and women included, saw it off, weeping all the way to Tilkala. Many believe, she said, it was due to the manuscript being taken away from the village that Hadishi got impoverished and deserted afterwards. You know that Hadishi Bible is one of the many among the huge collection of medieval artifacts kept in Svaneti. This is the village, as you all know. Removing sacred objects from what Svans considered to be their natural habitat, their natural environment, not only disturbs the social, religious, and political order for locals, but violates the rights of the holy objects themselves. Ganzi, which literally means treasure, as you all know, as Svans most often refer to the sacred objects stored in churches and museums, that rather than being treated as passive entities, passive materiality, is related to and sensed as what some anthropologists have called objects with subjectivities, or sensible objects, or pressured heritage, which means that they're treated as agents with the power of their own. In looking at from this perspective about what art historians and scholars of the Christianity study in Svaneti, we try to understand Ganzi as something else. So for Svans, Ganzi is not a property in a conventional sense of the word, and they claim ownership to it, and if you've been to Svaneti, you know it's always contested who should keep, where these artifacts should be kept. They don't think they're entitled to it as a material property. Instead, Svans treat the relics as objects with subjectivities, as things that beyond their thingness and beyond their divine mediacy have immediate, autonomous form of power. And this power is, in that sense, they are alive and they have needs and desires, and not only as separate entities, for instance, separate icons or separate churches, but as living entities that are entrenched in their living environment. So once removed to a museum, for instance, they no longer function as and perform as agents. And we explore some of the ways in which this happens, not only in terms of how locals believe this to be true, but how really it affects the dwelling, the forms of dwelling and the forms of socio-political order in the villages. So our point here, this is why I'm showing you the photo. You've all seen this, but showing you the ways in which the churches are located in the village are an important aspect of their not only the religious practice, but the forms of dwelling that at the center of which we find these artifacts. And svipis, which are central courts located alongside the churches, and most of the time, which are secular common spaces that villagers occupy on a daily basis, are part of this not only religious practice, but of the socio-economic order, political order of the village life. And then at the same time, we find how hills and mountains and forests and their ability to hide things and their ability to produce these barriers and difficult pathways are also part of the local forms of dwelling and religious practice in Svaneti. So our point here, apart from showing the social life of Ganzi and these different artifacts, is to show that their power as agents, so their ability to make things happen of the objects, goes beyond Svan religious beliefs. And it is comprised of much more than precious artifacts kept in churches and the museums. So our conceptualization of Ganzi is rooted in what scholarship is known as materiality turn and affective. We're on the intersection of these two theoretical terms that place objects at the center of the analysis. And here I will read to you a quote from Jane Bennett. Jane Bennett is a political theorist. She's a philosopher who, in conversation with authors like Spinoza and Guattari and Deleuze, talks about assemblages and vibrant materialities. But Jane Bennett is a political theorist. She's interested in what happens to political ecology, or how do we ask questions about ethics and morality in political responsibility if we place non-humans, that is objects and environments, just as much at the center of our analysis of political order as human actors. So because we treat Ganzi as an assemblage of human and non-human agents and practices, I just wanted to give you an idea what we consider under assemblages. Assemblages are ad hoc groupings of diverse elements of vibrant materials of all sorts. And throughout this presentation, we will show how these different actants vibrate in different ways. They have uneven topographies because some of the points at which the various affects and bodies cross paths are more heavily trafficked than others. And so power is not distributed equally across its surface. So if you've been to Svaneti, you know that guarding Ganzi and churches and museums could be one of those locations which are heavily trafficked, where tensions arise between different agents and actors. The effects generated by an assemblage are rather emergent properties. Emergent in their ability to make something happen is distinct from the sum of vital force of which materiality considered alone. And precisely because each member actant maintains an energetic pulse slightly off from that of the assemblage, an assemblage is never a stolid block, but an open-ended collective. So if we wanted to see what that open-ended collective of Ganzi would look like, it would look like something more like this, in my opinion, which involves it's a heterogeneous network of different kind of actors, which involves institutions, objects at the center of them, but also natural environment, like trees are important, in religious practice, like cherry trees or pine tree, yeah, or hills and forests, and weather and nature. You probably all know that one of the big aspects of Lamproba ritual, for instance, for Svans, is how the fire is reflected on the snow. So the seasons are part of that. But then we see that at the center of this assemblage or network is practices of care, which materialize in the village life, and practices of guarding, which you've all encountered if you try to enter any of these churches. And this can be very intense forms of guarding, and some of the militaristic aspects of it we'll talk about, Nikoloz will talk about later. And we see how the state and the Orthodox Church interact, and where you see the red lines, that would be where the tensions arise between different actors. But we also see that all of that tensions produce kind of different kind of affects and emotional attachments to the objects. So just to follow on that, this is the image we have in mind when we follow Bennett's work in saying that the locus of agency is always a human, non-human working group. It says that, in simple terms, that would be saying that all of these actors depend on one another. So that's why an actor never really acts alone. Bodies enhance their power in or as a heterogeneous assemblages. So you will need not only human subjects for this assemblage to work, but for natural environments, for the knowledge and the memories, and this is why we talk about symbolic treasure. But most importantly, Bennett looks at this heterogeneous assemblage as a different form of public itself, that we should think about political public not solely as comprised of human subjects, but of all these different kinds of entities. But the important thing is that publics as a non-human collectives are provoked into existence by a shared experience of harm. And that is the key to understanding of Ganzi in the ethnographic context, because there are different kind of harms that are imagined and that arise in relation to the sacred artifacts. That is theft, and you would have heard a lot of stories and memories and legends and histories about the attempts of theft or actual theft of the objects historically and in contemporary context. So that's where guarding occurs. And then, or gains meaning. Then there is nature of the sacred object, like as a phenomena, as a materiality itself, it is prone to decay. It is something that is not enabled by human agents, but it's something that it just happens to it. It's a power of the object itself to make things happen. And then they're prone to profanity, right? They're constantly in need of being cared for to refrain from profanity. And there are different ideas how that should be done, from locals to Orthodox Church, and that's where the tensions also arise. So then we look at how agency becomes distributed across these ontologically heterogeneous field. I just want to check how my own time. So this is just the points I have already made. There is a big literature in anthropology that places objects at the center of the analysis, and some of them have revisited, like classic studies like Malinovsky's Kula ritual, to look at how these artifacts, ceremonial objects that Malinovsky talks about themselves, produce value and meaning for humans. And there are incredible parallels that can be drawn between Svaneti's ethnographic case and other ethnographic cases where anthropologists have talked about occult life of things in the context of indigenous societies, or the indigenous understanding of property and ownership rights that are very similar to the Svan understanding. So when Svans talk about Gandhi and claim ownership to it, they primarily use these three kind of formulations. We have been taking care of Gandhi all this time, vuvlit, and movla, as the Georgian speakers know, is the same word used for taking care of a kid, for instance. And caring practices would involve not only just making sure they're not stolen or don't go bad, but caring means performing the religious practices properly. But also they use the village resources and allocate funds to restore and preserve some of the items. We have kept Gandhi for this country. So that would be shemovunachet, with the prefixes of the verb is a very interesting one that shows a specific kind of relation to the national space. And we are guarding Gandhi. So all these three, I mean, it's important, this framing is important for me because each term implies different set of relations and different abstractions about self-other relations between locals and the state, or between locals and the national space, locals and the enemies, and so forth, and different degrees of alienation from these different spaces. And it shows these kind of tensions that are produced, but also how caring and guarding becomes an act of political sovereignty or subjectivity for Svans themselves. So then Svan's sensibility toward holy objects in churches is defined by specific forms of interaction that they have with these entities, and it's not just guarding and locking or beliefs and myths about them, but the daily encounters, the forms of dwelling that constitute local forms of political sovereignty. Now, the relationship between religion, power, materiality, and guarding is historically shaped, and Nikoloz will continue from that point.
Thank you. I'll be really brief, actually. My contribution to this project is really from my interest in the cult of saints and the materiality of sainthood and the relics of the saints, and how the relics of the saints are conceptualized as treasure. So I've written a book which hopefully will appear over the next 2 months in Edinburgh. So what we're really interested in, from my perspective, is how things and how treasure are used to stabilize society. How as Michele has mentioned, our relationship, well, famously said, our relationship, social bonds, would be areas, clouds, where they only contracts between subjects. In fact, the object, specific to hominides, stabilizes our relationships. It slows down the time of our revolutions. The object for us makes our history slow. So in my research in the medieval history, especially in Armenian and Georgian sources, I was specifically interested in how the relics of the saints as material objects, and also how material treasure, were used in political discourses in terms of political legitimacy and also to use a Platonic term in terms of to arrest the change of a generation and decay, as it were. And this is something that transpires also in Svan, in local ethnography. So we've interviewed quite a few people. Actually, Nutsa, I have no interviewing skills being a historian. I like dead people. So she likes living people. There's a big difference. And then this transpires pretty much everywhere. So if you listen to some of the most zealous keepers, there's one particular famous person in Latali, whom you've probably heard of him. When Nutsa interviewed him, he was very adamant about the reasons why he would never show anyone, or would never sort of introduce the famed manuscript into the public discourse. And the reason this was so was extremely complicated in the sense that this item, it being Institut, where it is, it contributes to sort of a stabilization of society, of history, of sort of metaphysical order as such. It could be sort of blown out of proportions, obviously, but from his perspective, this was indeed so. Now, the other interesting aspect that I'm also curious was the famed poem in Ulpuli is specifically centered around treasure. Now, what I've been researching over the last few years was specifically the tradition of the discovery of treasure, whether material treasure or the relics of the saints, as a mark of divine legitimacy and as a mark of charismatic authority. And however, this usage of relics, or usage of material treasure, is fairly unique to Svaneti in the sense that it is used in this particular poem from Ushkuli as a sort of marker of the realm. It's the protector of the realm from northern invaders, and specifically it's a treasure that is inside the church of Lamania in Ushkuli, but also the treasure sort of surrounds the gates. It marks the limits of the holy limits and marks the limits of the realm of Ushkuli. So that is an interesting point of how treasure contributes to the protection of the realm, to the protection of the metaphysical and historical order. The other aspect that was also striking in our interviews and also resonates to my personal interest is the same sort of assemblage that Nutsa was talking about recently. For example, we had an interview with a fairly interesting person in Ypres, in Latali, whose perception of space, time, objects, churches, religious festivals was extremely syncretic, as it were. So he would always point, after a few shots obviously, he would always point to a certain imagined horizon that was the imagined boundary between free Svaneti and the Svaneti and the Sadovishkuliano, the other part of Svaneti. And he would complain about a recent attempt by Bechuans, or the other village, to take over the lands from them. And for him, this was a sort of a continuation of the century-old attempts to take over free Svaneti. And he would always, when he discussed this, he would always refer to the specific feast that was established in one of the churches in Ypres to commemorate the fact that the Latalians defended the borders, defended the limits of free Svaneti from the encroachment from the feudals from the south, from the west. And he would always refer to items, and this was again sort of we had a very good sense of this assemblage of space, time, items, objects, and churches. Now, I definitely have to mention why we're interested in this, because, well, Egas, you're all aware of Egas' project on the cult of military, of warrior saints, so as part of this project, and I was specifically interested in how warrior saints were conceptualized in Svaneti, and why is there such an obsession with this Jigaragi. Now, the interesting thing about Jigaragi is obviously, for us, the way the Georgians understand is that Jigaragi is Saint George. But if you ask locals, Jigaragi is not Saint George, but is a warrior saint par excellence. Is the warrior saint. It's sort of an abstract understanding of a riding saint, and there's a particular obsession with Jigaragi as a sort of a defender of all this that would be talked about.
I'm now that.
Yes, huh?
Nalzer would Nali Ratuakaris. Nali Rogorari. Horseshoe. Yeah, no, I mean, but that came with a story. We asked like what it was. It was a seal that we found out later, but one of the versions of local versions, whether it's a horseshoe because of Jigaragi, they said, because it's a warrior saint. And so they see these footprints of militarism and warrior saints everywhere.
Yeah. And just as a final note, it was during one of our earlier fieldworks, during yet another visit to one of the dozens of richly decorated churches, that we noticed a striking and universal tendency. And this was actually the entry point. This is how our interest actually was born in the whole subject. The expectation of the local people, of those who were guarding these churches, was that yet another scholar came to take pictures of their frescoes of their churches, their icons and their crosses. Year after year they have been asked to open the doors to the churches that from their churches have suddenly turned into some abstract national heritage. Hundreds and hundreds of photos are taken of the same frescoes, yet they themselves are nowhere to be seen. This is universal complaint. This is something that we always hear in these churches. As pointed out by several keepers, they never see the results of these pictures. Not even the publications and albums reach them eventually. And this is something that they've been really adamant about this. Hence the occasional irritation and conflict over the usage of flashlight, the behavior in churches, dress code, access to the I'm sure you all experienced this. Don't stand here, just a random demand will just pop up without, just don't stand here, stand here. No one was going to say why, just because I'm saying so. By contrast, as soon as they're asked for their opinions, or as soon as they realize that one does not attempt to create a cleavage between them and the churches and the frescoes, the usually grim and reserved keepers, or masters of the keys, become fairly eloquent, friendly, and sometimes even charming. On several occasions, as for example in Gallo, we had a wonderful experience. The otherwise silent and grim keeper became particularly eloquent when he was asked to speak of the Laguka church, its story, items, and the famed chest and its contents. And the stories that we heard from him were absolutely, we've never even known of those examples. After a few shots of Rachi, he looked at Nutsa and said, "Look at you, I have never spoken so much." I mean, he was really surprised at himself. I don't usually speak that much, but he was really eloquent at some point. But I think it also helped that we helped him in the kitchen. So. Now, yes, these are just a few remarks that I wanted to say from my perspective. So again, Nutsa will probably say concluding remarks.
We just have a couple of minutes left, so I'll just summarize on that from
5 minutes.
Yeah.
5. You do 5.
Yeah. I'll use those 5 minutes to summarize. I promise. So, Michele's The Guardians, as you know, as Nikoloz mentioned, are really adamant about their obligation to protect the churches. But some of the demands that sometimes sound like random demands, stand here, do not use flash, and so forth, sometimes do really come from rational reason. They're in their own understanding. A lot of times we heard the idea that one of the reasons that churches are locked not only to protect them from the outsiders like tourists and thieves, but because the deities or the holy objects should not be disturbed. And that's that's also that comes up with the pleading swearing ritual, icon swearing ritual, that icon swearing is not something Svans do just randomly and very often. It is a disturbance that again speaks to the autonomous power of these objects to get angry, to remember what you've done in generations and then pay revenge. But despite these, but against these beliefs that Svans have that make sense in their own terms, why they treat these objects the way they treat them, this adamant forms of guarding and militarism that we see throughout Svan, not only in forms in the practices of guarding the churches, but militarism is really evident in their religious performances as well. If you've been to Lichani Shoba ritual, the way the prayer itself is very militaristic just in its sound.
I can show it to you at some point.
Yeah. But it is due to these historical circumstances, the way swans have been conceptualized, and these contemporary practices, that they're often looked at as untamed, uncivilized, brute Caucasians, Highlanders, with the mind of their own. And because they've been as defiant subjects. So while their resistance, for instance, to Russian imperial power, to Sovietization or Soviet rule in general, and their ability to preserve Ganzi, and their dedication to guard these objects are romanticized by urban elite, by people like us, as part of this national narrative of Georgians being resistant warriors and heroes against enemy. Their defiance of the state law and peculiar religious cults have reinforced their image as untamed citizens. So even like during my last trip, I heard this from a visitor from Tbilisi saying to someone, you know Swans were pagan up until recently. They've just become religious. So that was her understanding. But the important thing is that locals are themselves very much aware of the ideas and the imaginaries that are out there about them. And then they act as a counterpoint to these imaginaries or in response to them oftentimes. So they would start talking to you on a random conversation that starts with a polemical strike on something that has been said about elsewhere. This ritual isn't pagan, for instance. If you I would ask a random question about something else, and then it would be a counterpoint to something that they assume you think. Now, these ideas about Swans as brute and untamed subjects is, in a way, a legacy of the Russian Orientalism or Russian imperialist discourse. And they serve as counterpoints, as I said, to Swan's own discourse about identity and history and their own belonging to the national space. And this is why I talk about how national belonging is then, Swan belonging is an anxious form of belonging in a way. And then the Ganzi and guarding Ganzi and taking care of Ganzi becomes a central practice for both pleading their allegiance to the national space and to resisting these hegemonic ideas about the Highlanders themselves. So in our argument, just to finish it off, how the objects, how this symbolic treasure acts as it does, exerts agency and power, one of the claims we're making is it kind of smuggles in different mythic cycles and realms of memory. And if you, whenever you stand next to a church and ask a question to a Swan, there'll always come up one of these mythic cycles. So their resistance to Russians, for instance, anti-communist resistance, or their belonging or not belonging to the medieval Georgian kingdom. And then these mythic cycles, through the objects, produce an image of Swans as limit figures, but also as privileged publics who are able to preserve this national treasure. But they're in their own ways of dwelling and living in political evasions, they become what in literature is called subaltern subjects. So it's a kind of defiant community. But these characteristics, personal characteristics that we see most adamantly kind of materialized in the character of Nikoloz, the guardians, is, and we saw, like in the previous presentation, we saw a quote from Strabo as describing Swans as fighters and brave people. It's a kind of roaming imaginary about themselves as well. And it is reinforced in daily practices and forms of dwelling that we observed around Ganzi. Thank you very much, and a special thank you to Tsitsi Guledani, who gets really angry when she's thanked.
And who will be the guardians of this one?